The Spiritual Scientist podcast is today joined by Angus Hawkins. And Angus is someone I came across watching YouTube videos about Rudolf Steiner and his work, especially in regards to philosophy of freedom. And Angus had organized study groups and different talks with different people to really actually work through philosophy of freedom online, which was really exciting to watch and interesting. I haven't watched them all, I have to admit, but
there's a lot.
There's a lot there. But it is a book that, and it's not just a book; it's a process that I've struggled with a lot. I sort of came to Steiner's work a different way around through the book "How to Know Higher Worlds" or "Knowledge of the Higher Worlds." How is it attained? And so the philosophy of freedom is something that I've actually got a goal this year to by Christmas I want to have worked through it properly. So that's a goal I've got, and I'm hoping Angus can help me.
We'll definitely tackle that one. Seriously, there's something really interesting going on in a group based in Germany, actually. But we can talk more about that as we get into the conversation.
Sure. Well, welcome to the podcast. Great to have you here. And we have had a preliminary conversation just to make sure that neither of us were psychopaths or something well, we probably still could be, but we're nice psychopaths who like to have a conversation. So
yeah, right.
Sorry, I jest, but where should we start, Angus? I mean, I've got a couple of specific things about philosophy of freedom, but maybe do you want to give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself, maybe how you came to be doing this work?
Okay, so I'm wondering how far I should go back in time. I'm an old guy now, so I can go back quite far. But we talked about this, and I thought it gives an interesting background, and you might like to link it into your own process. But this question of how people come into contact with Steiner is always an interesting question to ask. How did it happen? What was going on in your life? And for me, going back to 1992, I'd returned to the UK after living in Germany for 3 years, and I was going to be studying business at the University of Plymouth down in the southwest of England, close to, not very far from Tintagel, in the background there. And when I lived in Germany, I'd never come across Steiner. In actual fact, I don't think I'd read any philosophy up to that point in my life. But when I went to university, I started reading a lot of new age literature. It's like everything. There was a bookshop down in the Barbican in Plymouth, and I'd go down there and buy the books, whatever was there. And I came across loads of interesting people. I remember one person particularly interesting at that stage was a guy called Edgar Casey, and I read books by him. And for about nearly 2 years, I was I ate this content the whole time. And this is actually what I'm about to describe as something I've heard. It's actually fairly similar to other people's processes that happened to me. After about 2 years or so, it was, there's all these ideas about what could be, but where's the truth? Is there any truth even? So these really hard questions, just like your world is sort of like blown open by this like floor of ideas, like a lot of them coming from the West, but also it's like Western esoteric traditions. And there was one small question, and it's like a whole bunch of questions for me, which was interesting, which was the Atlantis. Was there anything to the Atlantis myth? And I happened to mention that to my then girlfriend, now wife's cousin, who was studying eurythmy. I didn't know what eurythmy was at that stage. And she said to me, "Oh, you might want to try Steiner. I think he's written something about it." So next time I was in Sweden at the time then, we headed down to Gothenburg, and I went to the bookshop and I found a book, and he was mentioned. And they didn't actually say much about it in the book, but it was enough to whet my appetite. So I thought, when I go back to the UK, to carry on studying. It would have been my third year at second year at university. I thought, okay, I'll see what's in the library there. And the first book that I found was The Philosophy of Freedom. And I read that. I can still remember some of those images. So I played a lot of badminton at the time there, and we used to take the bus up to the badminton at I can't remember the name of the place, but it's a little bit outside Plymouth. And the guys, I was usually like quite lively. The guy said, "What's Angus doing? He's reading a book about philosophy," and they were mocking me a little bit. So it was like quite out of character for me. Anyway, I finished reading that book. And thought, this is really interesting, but I've understood really this feeling. I know there's something of value there, and possibly even at that stage, I could have said at the real center, he like says something deeply, deeply profound, that you can't say anything about reality without thinking. Okay, he's like really positing it's like at the base of absolutely everything we can say about anything, you have to assume thinking. And that's like that struck me deeply. Anyway, so I read that book, but I can't say I was enamored. I was intrigued. And then I picked up a book. There were only two books in the library, I think. The other book was how do angels work in the astral body? And I read that, and I can still remember standing outside that library in Plymouth. I think it was quite a nice day actually, and saying to myself, Angus, you're not going to read Steiner again. You're never going to read Steiner again. It's like it was too wacky. It was too far out. But that's obviously not what happened. That would have been in April '94. But I was due to do my year out in and originally, sorry, I'm going on a little bit here, but there's lots of interesting. I'm missing out a lot of details, if that's any consolation. I was actually supposed to be studying in Kharkiv in the Ukraine. I'd learned a bit of Russian, and I was keen to go there. But basically, I wasn't able to go to the Ukraine because they didn't have any fax paper. I'm simplifying the story, but the essence of it is true. I didn't go there because of fax paper. So my supervisor at university, he said, how about going to Finland instead? I mean, they probably speak Russian there or something like that. It's quite close. He wasn't so hot on languages. But anyway, I went to Finland in the autumn there in August, and that's where my life changed, because I was going to do a project that I couldn't complete. But in the meantime, my supervisor, whilst I was studying in Turku, it's a town southwest of Finland, she had realized that I spoke German, that I knew who Steiner was. And she said, so would you like to investigate what he had to say about the Kalevala, which is basically, you got Tintagel in the background. It's a little bit, the national epic of Finland is this book called the Kalevala. And I said, yeah, why not? I didn't know what else to say, because I was just like, I had nothing else like planned. And this was a unique situation. I didn't realize this until afterwards, but actually there was an industrial magnate who created a foundation and like instituted a library, a library with all of the lectures. So that's obviously all the 6,000 lectures, all the books that Steiner wrote, but a lot of other books about esotericism, hermeticism, and religious texts. And it was there. So I was asked to do a piece of work in which Steiner's entire works, I mean, nowadays that's no big deal because you can just go on the web. But back then, that was huge. And I'd walked into this situation, and I lived in that library for 4 months whilst I was studying there doing this work, and it changed my life. So that's how I came
Wow.
to Steiner.
Mm,
How does that?
very interesting. Yeah.
What about you? What about you?
Yeah. So, well, it's really interesting to hear that. I've got a very good friend who's Finnish, actually. I've never asked her about the Finnish myths. So that'd be interesting to mention to her. But yeah, thank you for sharing that, by the way. I always find it really interesting as well to hear. It's not just interesting, it's kind of moving and a bit and quite mysterious as well. I think it's often you either bump up against this thing and then dive into it, or you don't, so that interesting things going on there. But yeah, I was early 20s. From at about 19, I started looking into spiritual things, and a bit like you, reading lots of different new age stuff, bit of Buddhism. Actually, there was an American born guru. I think his name's Adi Dar. He's dead now. But my girlfriend at the time, who didn't become my wife, her auntie, I borrowed her auntie's car when I was teaching music and driving around to different places. And in the car were these tapes, and the tapes were like conversations of this American-born guru guy.
Yeah.
And I was like, I was blown away. I was almost considering going and joining the ashram, there was one near Melbourne somewhere. I didn't, thankfully. But yeah, and I was really exploring lots and lots of different things, but just these concepts about enlightenment, concepts about, that we were a spiritual being and not just a physical being, and all this stuff, which in my late teens I kind of rejected. They came back in full force, I suppose, around that age. And then, yeah, I won't go too much into, but there was just one interesting experience with this guru guy. I bought his book and I started reading it, and I think he was really probably quite an advanced person spiritually. But towards the end of the book, he says, "I am the God man, and you have to worship me,"
Oh, wow.
basically. And when I read that, I actually dropped the book. I threw it down and kicked it under my bed. And then that night I couldn't actually have it under the bed. And so I actually went and threw it out. I should have burned it probably, but I just threw it in the bin. And I didn't recycle it, which is probably not good. But
that was allowed back in the day.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That, and I still allow myself to throw out peanut butter jars. So that's a big confession today. But peanut butter jars, who's going to clean them out? Anyway, so yeah, lots of different spiritual things. Tried out different meditations, Buddhist stuff, and just dabbled really. And then one day I went into this bookshop and asked for a book about meditation, which was just around the corner from my house in Melbourne, in Kew, if anyone knows Melbourne suburbs at all. And originally it was called Books for the Journey, but it got changed to the Steiner bookshop. But I didn't really know anything about Steiner at that time. And I went in, and interestingly, they didn't try and sell me a book. The lady said, "Oh, we've got a library of Rudolf Steiner upstairs, and you'll find something about meditation up there." And I went, okay. I went up and I had a bit of a look, and then I said, I think I said, "There's a lot of books up there. Can you help me?" And it turns out that was actually the home of the Anthroposophical Society in Melbourne as well. And I can't actually remember if she pointed me towards How to Know Higher Worlds or if I just found it, but I opened it up, and basically from the first couple of paragraphs, something inside me just said, "This is me."
We've all got a seed in us. It has to capture you, doesn't it?
Yeah, it was like it was what I've since heard described as the moral logic. It was this impeccable, it was scientific in a sense. It was logic. It was very, very logical, but it was the moral logic of it that really grabbed me. And that was it. Basically, I just read voraciously from that point on, and I haven't really stopped. So it's been over 20 years of and practicing the exercises on and off as well.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's
Yeah.
that's my journey. But I am really interested in philosophy of freedom because it's something I haven't. I've
Yeah.
tried to read it several times, and the last time I tried, or the last time I did read it, I did understand a lot more, and I did have more experiences that made sense to me. But maybe you can talk to us a little bit about what the book is, or what the purpose of that particular text is.
Wow. Um,
Or if there's a better question, if it's simpler to describe in
yeah,
your own
it's
words, where to start.
um, there's if you're people familiar with spiritual science, anthroposophical thinking will have heard various quotes about the importance of the philosophy of freedom, and I'd heard them, and one of the famous ones is by Johannes Walter von Stein, uh, where he asked Steiner, so what's going to be left of anthroposophy in 1,000 years, and he says the philosophy of freedom. So already there, he's like, whoa, he's putting a lot of focus on this book. But if I like skip forward, it's like in my story there. So forward wind to basically around about 18 months ago, when the world was going absolutely mad. I mean, it is still mad, but in relation to the conversation you're going to be having with this other person in the not so distant future, the madness around Kuf, and this had taken me to a stage where I had informed myself enough to be certain that this isn't what it was made out to be by TPB. Yeah, the powers. Oh, I missed out a T in there, didn't I? TPTP.
Oh, right. Okay, we can't say that on YouTube.
I don't know. I don't know what we were allowed to say.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, so I had realised I had to do something, because you described like you haven't like stopped reading Steiner for it's like 20 years since you first encountered him, and for me, I had a like incredibly intense period. It's like for between like being in Finland and basically having kids, which would have been about 7 years later, 7, 8 years later. It's like, no kids, you got time to do these type of things and you can dedicate yourself to a lot of study. And I did a lot. And then kids come along and I kept on reading, but obviously not as intensely. I had a business to run. I worked as, I had my own business where I was basically, my job was to get people to talk in English and to give lessons, but basically it was getting people to communicate in English. And fantastic job. Got to know a lot of interesting people, but that meant so like the time was being dedicated to anthroposophical studies. But we come to this moment of 18 months, 2 years ago, and I realized I have to do something. And that stage, I'm rereading for the probably third or fourth time the 12 lectures by Steiner on the Gospel of John, one of my absolute favorites. And in the final lecture of that, I'm actually going to read it. I'm just going to read it so that we've got a little bit of meat here. So I was rereading this series of lectures, which I really enjoy. And Steiner says, the refashioning of the astral body indirectly through meditation and concentration is called by an ancient name catharsis or purification. Catharsis or purification has as its purpose the discarding from the astral body all that hinders it from becoming harmoniously and regularly organized, thus enabling it to acquire higher organs. It is endowed with the germ of these higher organs, what he talks about in Knowledge of the Higher Worlds. It is only necessary to bring forth the forces which are present in it, We have said that the most varied methods can be employed for bringing about this catharsis. A person can go very far in this matter of catharsis if, for example, he has gone through and inwardly experienced all that is in my book, The Philosophy of Spiritual Activity, and feels that this book was for him a stimulation, and that now he has reached a point, or reached the point, where he can himself actually reproduce the thoughts just as they are presented. Okay, and he goes on in that lecture. And that really spoke to me at that specific moment in time. I probably read it at that stage. I might have read it about 5, 6, 7 times. Each time you learn a little bit more, but I thought, right, I'm going to do something. And I made contact. There's a guy on the net called Tom Last, and I did a little bit of work with him for reasons that I don't need to go into here. How can I put this diplomatically? His perception of what the philosophy of freedom is has nothing to do with anthroposophy, if I could put it like that. And he would. I think he would be quite happy if he heard me making that statement. But for me, that was hugely problematic, because the philosophy of freedom is that the activity, the spiritual activity that he's talking about in the title, and which we'll dig into in a little bit, it's that out of this activity that the whole of spiritual science emerges.
Angus, just to
yeah.
clarify, you mentioned that title, because there are a couple of different titles in English. So one is the philosophy of freedom, the philosophy of spiritual activity is another, intuitive thinking as a spiritual path is another title, just in case anyone didn't catch that.
It's a good point. And really, the spiritual activity was the one that Steiner recommended as a title, and is the one that they've used in this in this particular lecture. But at the heart of it is really this: once we get to really truly know what our thinking is, experience it not because somebody else is telling us it as a doctrine or a guru, it's like, I know better, it's like you've got to look at it like this, but it's this invitation to discover this activity that lives, not just lives in you, but actually is the whole basis of your being. Okay, because if we come back to that point that I made earlier, there is no statement that we can make about life or ourselves without thinking about it. So it's not just a cute metaphor. It's not just an analogy. This is quite literally the essence of our being. It is out of thinking that we are born. As Steiner says in the philosophy of spiritual activity, we live by the grace of thinking.
I think it's really important to emphasize that. So, with all of our scientific advancements, and the world we live in is very much, how shall I say it? It's very much imbued and full of this scientific way of thinking that takes it as granted that what we look at when we look out at nature, that we're actually seeing it correctly, that what we're seeing is just what it is. And then we take our measurements, or we do our experiments, and then we measure what happened, and then we repeat it, or we get someone else to repeat it. And so therefore we come to discover the way things behave, or we come to discover facts or scientific truths. And it's like throughout the history of philosophy, philosophers have taken these various steps. And I had a great conversation with Matt Segal recently, where he sort of walked us through it quite well. It was a bit too much for me, to be honest. He was brilliant. I just need to go back and watch the video a few times. But you go back to David Hume, who sort of was the most intense skeptic, and got to the point where basically said we can't ever know anything about anything. In some, I'm paraphrasing, but our limited ability to know anything about anything, and so he basically becomes, as Matt correctly said, an agnostic about everything, about knowledge itself. And then you have other thinkers, and I'm probably going to get it wrong about what order they come in, but Immanuel Kant gets to the point of saying, well, actually, what does he get to the point of saying? I'm probably not going to articulate it very well, but Steiner really sort of pushes the envelope with everything and goes further. And it's like the history of philosophy has led us back to the point of going, actually, what is the tool that we use to understand anything? It has to start with thinking. And if we don't know what that is, how can we know what anything else is? I don't know if that's a very good way to put it, but.
Okay, let's jump a little bit into Kant there, because there's another really important book that is the prologue to the Philosophy of Freedom, which is Truth and Science, or Truth and Knowledge, Wahrheit und Wissenschaft. And is hugely helpful to have read that as well. And the guys that I work with, Jeff, Jonathan and Kate, we're looking at the idea of actually expanding our series. It's like going forward to really go deep into that book, because some of the problems that arise, natural questions that arise for a reader in 4, they're actually comprehensively dealt with in 3.
So sorry, you mean that by 3 and 4 you mean these first
GA3 or CW,
these first 4 texts of Steiner. So just to make sure that's clear.
So we're probably going to do a series on there, because there was, for example, you'll hear quite competent anthroposophists talking about the problem of something that's referred to as the given. We don't need to go into detail unless it becomes obvious that we do. But actually, he deals with this issue that he brings up very briefly in chapter 3 or 4. Can't remember exactly where it is. But it's comprehensively dealt with in 3, so that having read that, you can go into 4 and go like, "Whoa, I know what this is," rather than what on earth is going on there. But we were going to talk about Kant. So the reason I mentioned GA3 is because in that, basically Steiner clearly elucidates on how one of the fundamental mistakes that Kant makes, despite, he's very careful, as anybody who reads Steiner is. He's like, he gives him praise where it's due. How his philosophy is a huge leap forward in certain sense, but also how there is a bias. He's set conditions for what can be counted as a theory of knowledge, epistemology. How do we know things? And Steiner demonstrates in GA3 that he wasn't unconditional. He already set some conditions by which he would judge whether it was a valid epistemology or not.
Sorry, is that Kant that does that, or Steiner?
Exactly. And Steiner is demonstrating how this can't be considered a true epistemology, because he's already setting conditions which obviously are based in thinking.
Okay, and then you would have to have justifications for those conditions,
which all require thinking. So it's one way you can describe it as all of these epistemologies that don't actually tackle the topic of what thinking actually is, which is basically every epistemology prior to Steiner, is all of these are floating in the air. They don't have a real foundation. You might like to call it, I don't know, genetic epistemology, or I don't know, whatever types of things that you think's like form the absolute, but mathematical
All
epistemology.
right. Yeah. So genetic, as in Genesis, the genesis of something. Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking quite literally with it's like genetics, like using that as the basis for understanding, so like all theory of knowledge, or evolutionary biology, and using that, saying that's the truth, and we're going to base our theory of knowledge, our understand of everything based on that. But you've had to think to get to an evolutionary idea on what epistemology is. Or sorry, I phrased that incorrectly. You have to have thought about it to say that this is an evolutionary epistemology. And Steiner demonstrates how Kant makes this this mistake, and then this becomes sort of like part of the basis for finding the answer, finding a solution to this contradiction about how can we even know anything about the world. And that means going into recognizing that it is thinking which allows us to know the world. What is the relationship of thinking to the world? What is our relationship to thinking? And this is, it's a, he says, well, just I'll bring back up that text. You know well, you're not the only one who's struggled with this. There are lots of people, but there's that text that I was reading a little bit before, a little bit further in the lecture from Luke, from John, he says, catharsis will be developed to a high degree, reading this. For the important point in such things as this book is that the thoughts are all placed in such a way that they become active. In many other books of the present, just by changing the system a little, what has been said earlier in the book can just as well be said later. In the philosophy of spiritual activity, this is not possible. Page 150 can be as little placed 50 pages earlier in the subject matter as the hind legs of a dog can be exchanged with the forelegs. For the book is a logically arranged organism, and the working out of the thoughts in it has the effect similar to an inner schooling. So we are really going to school when we read this book, and that makes big demands on us.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. When I was talking to Matt Segal as well, he was saying that it's in a similar way to reading Hegel and the other German idealists, that you're actually doing something. You're actually going through a process. You're actually working on something just by reading it. And I think that's very, very much the case with philosophy of freedom or philosophy of spiritual activity. Yeah.
And in that sense, we could do like an analogy with learning mathematics. If the foundations aren't in place, like plus, minus, divide, and multiply, then it's like any more advanced mathematics, it's sitting on shaky foundations. So it requires a rigorous honesty with your own thinking and whether you've understood it. And we can also, we all deceive ourselves, because when we think we've understood it, there's a tendency to think, oh, I got it, and I've fallen into this trap before. Okay, yeah, no, because there is this genuine sensation, experience. My thinking has grown. Conceptually, I've become clearer about an aspect where, so like my thinking was fuzzy before, but that isn't. It requires like many times. The more often we go through it, the sharper the clarity becomes about like why is he saying this here and now? And like he says, why couldn't he have said it 10 pages earlier or 10 pages later? It becomes thought edifice. I mean, where you can't, if the first floor you can't build the second floor before you've built the first floor.
Yeah, and I think that sort of goes back to what I was saying as well about that it's a process, that it's a work that you're doing,
Yeah.
as opposed to just a series of concepts that you try to understand. And I think I read a paper a little while ago. I'll have to find it to remember what it is, or I'll put it in the comments below or something.
Yeah.
But it was this philosopher. I think he was writing back in the 80s, and he does a beautiful job of very simply laying out the history of philosophy and where we've got to now, or where we've got to, after David Hume and Immanuel Kant, and sort of what they did, what they actually did, what they gave us, and what they moved us towards. And his conclusion, where he comes to, is either we have to admit that we can't ever know anything about anything in reality,
In reality, yeah, it's
or
all illusion.
it's all an illusion, or we dive back into religious dogma. And so that's what he does. He then says we just have to go back and become religious. He says about going into the Orthodox Church, because religion is the only thing that can take us beyond that point, according to him. And so I think that's where a lot of people are at right now. Just to sort of make this relevant to today, I think a lot of people have realized, or even come to this stage, especially in the postmodernist way of thinking that a lot of people have today. A lot of people will say phrases like, nothing means anything. There is no meaning. We're just a material being, and as soon as we die, that's the end, and that's it. The universe has no meaning. The cosmos has no purpose, and so there is this nihilism that is sort of just floating around in the air, and it's built into sort of everything you read. You open a newspaper, and it's in the background of the way we speak, even. And so I think we've reached this point, and especially in regards to what happened over the last couple of years, where people are either saying nothing means anything and just go into nihilism. I mean, if you really think about it, that doesn't add up, that whole thing anyway, because if nothing means anything, then the sentence "nothing means anything" doesn't mean anything, etc. But anyway, and then they either do that, or they go back to religious dogma and just hold on to the dogmas in whichever brand of that they want to go to. And I feel this desperate longing to say, read Philosophy of Freedom, or even anything else of Steiner, to sort of find a way in, that there is another way. There is a third option. That might be a very simplistic way to put it, but that's what I see happening.
There's another key idea. Let's see if I can remember how this was phrased, but Steiner mentions how the concept of authority is something that has to die. We have to become our own authorities. And what that means is that it's like the skepticism we're seeing towards, it's like reaching levels we couldn't have even begun to imagine 20 years ago. Steiner basically said, this is coming. And I'm not saying he was the only one, but he was particularly clear. It's sort of like any spiritual understanding of the world has to be based in an own experience, and not a doctrine, and not a dogma. And this is really why the philosophy of freedom is unique. If we compare it's like knowledge of higher worlds with the philosophy of freedom. When you read knowledge of higher worlds, there's an impeccable logic in that book, but you still are taking certain things that he's saying in good faith. It's like you're saying, I'm neither rejecting or nor accepting, but I'm playing with the idea. But as the exercises get more demanding, well, I mean, if you're going to really invest all the meditative concentration effort, you've got to have a strong belief that there's real substance to what Steiner is saying. And it is, in that sense, it's a leap of faith. Philosophy of freedom is a different kind of leap of faith, because rather than entering directly into specific meditative exercises, recommendations on how you've got let's take like the seed the seed meditations there. So like you do this for a certain reason, and it's explained more or less like why it's important and how it will slowly begin to work. And there are other books like Road to Knowledge and 16 and 17, I can't remember the other title, but which are also like a series of meditations which you chew over. So there's that approach, whereas the philosophy of freedom is saying, know your thinking. That which created everything you know is your true essence. And if you follow that thread far enough, you'll arrive at exactly the same place as knowledge of the higher worlds is going to. But the huge difference being is you're not actually having to accept anything on authority. Everything that's laid out is argued in such a way that it becomes obvious that this is a correct description of what thinking is itself. It's like its essential nature. And this is where the second title, philosophy of spiritual activity, becomes really pertinent, is because as you dig into it, you don't just believe or accept on faith that thinking is a spiritual activity. You begin to experience directly how it is. And so I'm trying to contrast that's like the two paths in, it's like to spiritual science, and why how the philosophy of freedom is different. And then Steiner's got this also curious expression specifically about the philosophy of freedom, and he talks about it being the safer path, which is also an interesting idea. Why does he say it like that? And I've got my own thoughts around that, but I don't know if you want to go.
Share your own thoughts. I mean, I would just say as well, just to add to what you've said about the difference, I think you can treat How to Know Higher Worlds, that book, and the exercises therein, they can be treated like a scientific experiment in many ways. Try this out, see if it bears fruit for you. And that doesn't mean necessarily that I'm going to begin having spiritual experiences immediately or anything like that. But because of what I call the moral logic of the book, you immediately see how doing that particular exercise, especially when it comes to the actual moral aspects, for example, the exercise which is often referred to as open-mindedness. So when you hear something, not to immediately form a judgment for or against it, but rather to keep the question open, keep a question mark next to it until you have sufficient information to form a judgment. When you practice that and try it out, you see how that is just helpful in life.
Yes.
And he does say at one point in that book, even if someone isn't on a spiritual path or wanting to develop esoteric perceptions or anything like that, that it's still going to be a good thing to do in life. And I would maybe add that it would be also good, probably, or it could be good to practice those things along with the path of the philosophy of spiritual activity as well. So that's just what I wanted to add.
Absolutely. That's like the 6 thinking exercises that you're referring to there. They are, if those aren't in place, then they will either have to fall into place for you, and if they don't, so like also the philosophy of freedom isn't going to make sense to you, because all of the thinking exercises that you describe are teaching you to be more conscious of how your thinking affects decisions, emotions, and all this type of thing.
Right. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought of it like that before. That's maybe the path of the philosophy of freedom gets you to, by observing your thinking, you do that anyway. Or maybe the two books, or what's in the two books, speaks to each other. If that's
Yeah, I mean, Sergei Prokofiev, he did a book, Anthroposophy and the Philosophy of Freedom, where he basically he maps out how this idea that we're talking to here, that the philosophy of freedom and knowledge of higher worlds are both heading in the same direction.
that's right. You actually mentioned that in our last conversation, so
Yeah,
that got me very
and
excited.
yeah, and I mean, perhaps at some stage we do just like have a look at that together, but it is really valuable. It's just like how they mutually support each other. But the focus on thinking being itself being a spiritual activity and experiencing that directly is something that doesn't grow directly out of a reading and an understanding of knowledge of higher worlds. Through practice it does, but reading and understanding of the philosophy of freedom, my channel's called The Exceptional State, and in chapter 3 he digs into this exceptional state. What is it? It's this realization, and I'm scraping the surface here when I describe it, but let's say look at a TV screen. Imagine we're watching a television program or whatever, and we see all of these pixels dancing in different colors, and we make sense of it, and the sounds coming out, we also make sense of those, and that's the full reality for us. Now, when it comes to a television, all of us are capable of understanding that there were actors that were standing on stage, and there were directors, and there's the whole sort of like entourage of people. These events really took place in the past, and they weren't dead pixels on a screen, and dead speakers vibrating sound. No, these were real people talking and doing, and that has been recorded, packaged, it's like sent through electrical signals so that we can receive it. That type of relation, something real has created a simulation. As you dig into the exceptional state, that becomes a direct experience instead of a theory. So you realize there's this dawning awareness that if I really consider, or consider sounds like I'm thinking about it. I don't want to say I'm thinking about it. If I let the impulse that created the thoughts that I have, I don't think about the thoughts, but try to sense the activity that created those thoughts, that's already then I am beginning to meet up with this essence that is at the root of all thinking. And once this process reaches a certain intensity, Steiner says that's when objective imaginative consciousness arises, and it's like a meeting with the guardian at the threshold, a realization that that I am not the television screen. Going back to our metaphor, I am not the television screen. I am this everything that created what was put on that television screen. I don't know if you follow my thinking.
Yeah, I think I have followed it, and I think the key that I got in there when you were speaking was that it's not observing the thinking, the thoughts themselves. It's observing, is that the right word?
No, it's actually, technically, it's exactly the right word.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, okay. That was a fluke. Observing the activity of thinking. So, yeah.
Yeah. And
Or how it
you say that
arises. Is it like how it arises, where it comes from? I don't
yeah,
know.
all of those. All of those. I think you can it throughout history. So this contact, it's been described as like the absolute. It's the oneself. It's the one of Plotinus. It's this something. It's the logos. It's the something that creates everything. But we are just living in the little thing that it's created and thinking that's its essence, whereas we've seen what it can create as opposed to its essence. We're stuck in our own selves, which is an important part of the process. That this isn't a philosophy that like tries to negate the value of life. It's trying to find the correct relationship. As a human being, I am standing as like a pass-through point for, it's like there's I live in the physical world, and my senses they partake in that, but I am also a spiritual being in the sense that's like these impulses can also work through me, consciously or unconsciously. But
Okay, so yeah, there's a lot in there. I wrote down a word earlier that made what you just said just then made me think of, where he says the universal cosmic process. He uses a phrase, the universal cosmic process, and it sounds kind of out there, but it's not. Can you say what he means by that?
So what I think you might be speaking to, and again here, so we're as soon there's this saying which goes something along the lines of, it's one of the mystics from I think it's Angelus who said something along the lines of truth dies on my lips. And what it means is, as soon as I try to utter a truth, I've also excluded all the other billions of truths that are out there. So in the context of that, it's like
so we just
answer to your question.
We should just stop talking now and
yeah, that's right. Yeah. There's great emphasis. One of the problematic concepts for people coming to the philosophy of freedom fresh, especially if they don't have any interest in anthroposophical thinking, is the universal activity of thinking. So we were coming back to this idea, so like we can say nothing about the world without thinking about it. This universal activity is that which is giving us thoughts to give us little insights into how the world works. Or I'm going to actually be slightly more technical. When that activity lives in us, we create concepts which then allow us to recognize the truth of them in the outside world. So it's not, you talked about the scientific process. Science tends to think the truth is out there. It's like the X-Files. They're not wrong about that. But what they're not clear about is the relationship of how their thinking actually informs that. When we see the world, if we just perceive the world without thinking, it is nothing. So I know that sounds stupid to somebody who hasn't thought about these things, but quite literally, perception, any type of sensory perception without thinking, is nothing, or perhaps like I said, is nothing and everything at the same time. Because only once you start thinking about it can you start to pull out like certain aspects of it and talk about it.
Yeah, that makes me think about, I think it's an example. Maybe Steiner actually uses the example of somebody who is born blind and then has an operation and gains their sight. When they can first see, there's nothing. There's just a mess of light or not light or whatever, because they don't have the concepts for what they're perceiving. But you said there is nothing if we don't think.
For us
Yeah.
knowing human beings, there is
Yeah.
nothing without thinking, because the world's like these concepts that we create within ourselves and then recognize in the outside world, which allow us to make sense and describe the world and to do the science and this type of thing. Those concepts are real. So the concept of gravity, it's something that affects like all material objects. But if we haven't got that concept, then it's not there. And then if you strip away any concepts, then we can't say anything about reality itself, even though those, like the conceptual understanding of that world controls that world, or is like it's described conceptually. It becomes very tricky to talk about it.
I think it is very tricky to talk about. You have to actually experience it, and there is a good way to do that. I've got a great book by Henry Bortoft. Do you know who he is? Yeah, the Wholeness of Nature. And there's a brilliant picture in there, and it just looks like a whole lot of squiggles on the page. But when someone then tells you, or you read what is in that picture, all of a sudden you see.
Is it the giraffe one?
Yeah, I wasn't going to spoil it.
Sorry.
It doesn't matter. Maybe I'll pop it up. Maybe I'll pop it up. But yeah, then you realize that actually without the concept, you can't see anything. You can't perceive anything. And I think, right. Yeah.
Wonderful. I'm so glad you brought that in, because in that one example, you can experience directly, without anybody telling you, how you don't see with your eyes, you see with your thinking. Okay, so we were taking in those impressions of the black blotches, so like in this circle, but we couldn't see anything until, and then you go, oh, of course, yeah, it's a giraffe.
Yeah.
And that's what, so the philosophy of freedom, spiritual activity, is saying, really take this idea seriously. The world is nothing we see with our thinking, not with our eyes. And the deeper you enter into the extent to which that is true, the more you're entering into, like, directly into into the activity of thinking itself and beginning to experience how it is a spiritual activity. It's an essence that informs every perception that we have, informs every decision we ever make. It is that which is the basis of our lives.
That sounds like a pretty good place to wind up. Although we could go on for hours actually, but that sounded like a nice rounding off point. Did you have something to add?
Yeah, I did. So I don't know how long we've been going, an hour. So I do think one point that we haven't touched on, which was like you talked about, I don't know whether it was a New Year's resolution to look into the philosophy of freedom. We didn't get into the whole story of other things. But I would like to mention an initiative in Germany. There's a guy called Andreas. I'll send you the link afterwards that you can link it in the video where I've interviewed him. So he has this, it's an organization called Jahrestraining, or so annual training. It's an international effort where it's people from all around the world. So it's like creating these workshops to get people to read a little bit of the philosophy of freedom, like every day. It's like the very simplistically described, promise yourself to read 15 minutes of the philosophy of freedom every day over a 7-month period. And then there are 9 workshops where people can meet together and talk about what they understood, what they didn't understand, these type of things. So he and his sister and a few other important people that have created this training course, and it's been perhaps I'll just refer to the video for anybody who thinks, this year I want to do philosophy of freedom. Have a look at what this guy's doing. I'm going to be working more with him this autumn, so I'm going to actually be taking part, leading some of these. I don't know the full scope of it yet, but I've made the decision to work together with him and his organization there, because I see a lot of good being done there. So
Right. Well, yeah, absolutely. Whatever links you would like me to share that can point people towards your work or this group that you're talking about, more than happy to put that into the description.
Thanks.
Just one last thought before we wind up. Would you maybe you could just say something briefly about why do you think it's so important that people work through this particular book?
We are spiritual beings. I'm thinking of Graham Hancock here, where it's like we're like civilizations with amnesia. We've forgotten, because of the persuasive nature of materialism, that we are spiritual beings. And through reading the philosophy of freedom, we can begin to experience directly how that is a truth about our essential natures.
Sounds like a good enough reason to me. Well, Angus, thank you very, very much for your time. I've learned a great deal myself, and I'm gonna attempt to dive into the book again, because I really want to grasp something. I want to get something. I shouldn't say I'm gonna nail it. Like you said, it's an ongoing process, and our conceptual thinking can grow and become stronger and all of those things. But it has inspired me to commit to that. So thank you. And yeah, I'll be sure to share all your links, and just want to say thank you very much for this conversation, and maybe we can do it again sometime and go a little further.
I would love to. It feels like we had that much to say, and we said about that much. So yeah, if you feel like talking again, I'd be really honoured to come back and to talk more, to dig a little bit deeper.
Great, thank you. And I would just say at the end as well that, I really enjoy this podcast. It's great having people on to talk about it, but when it comes down to it, doing our own inner work is really where it's at. And in terms of actually working through a text or taking up the practice of certain spiritual exercises that are aimed at really making us more and more who we really are, or making us better in the world, making us more effective in the world, in our relationships, in our work. That's really the name of the game. I think I want to start sort of adding that at the end of the podcast, that it's fine to sit here and talk about it and listen to a YouTube video about it and everything. But if we can take that next step and actually begin to do some of the work, we will see the benefits of that, and
absolutely,
possibly the world will as well. Okay, well, thanks very much again, Angus, and look forward to
A real
being with you
pleasure.
soon.
Thanks, Mick. Bye.
All the best. Bye. Thanks very much for listening to the Spiritual Scientist podcast. If you'd like to support the show, you can make a one-time donation via PayPal, or if you'd like to become a member, you can make a recurring donation via Subscribestar. The podcast can be found on all good podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, and Google, and the video format can be found on Odyssey, Rumble, BitChute, Brighteon, and YouTube. Thanks very much for watching. Bye for now.